Okay, welcome back everyone to another episode of Global AI, the podcast. And it's episode 18, I'm told, and I honestly could not actually count them anymore. They're all everywhere. I mean, in fairness, it kind of feels like it's still the first few that we've been doing, but we've got a bit at it for a while now, I think. So we're back again. I'm Akanksha, one of the hosts, one of the AI MVPs here in Melbourne, and I am joined by my fabulous co-host, Somi.
Hi, Akanksha. Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us for another episode. As Akanksha mentioned, I love our chats and podcasts. I hope you all enjoy listening to us as well. I'm excited about today's topic.
Yes, exactly. And I think it's definitely something more and more I keep seeing in the industry now, especially around AI, because everyone wants the models. And now at least we're trying to be a bit more conscious about how we're using those models. So I'll introduce our guest for today. We've got Lee Hickin, who is the Microsoft Australia CTO. I will leave the rest of the introductions to yourself because I mean I tried to look through it earlier and I was like, nope, there's a bit too much going on. You're into so many different things. I feel like I'll leave you pick and choose whichever bits you want to talk about today.
Well, thank you for that. Thanks for the kind introduction. Yeah, I think there's too many words in that bio that it needs to be cut down a bit. So no, but as you said, I'm the CTO here at Microsoft for Australia and New Zealand. But I also have the pleasure of holding the role of what we call in Microsoft Responsible AI Lead for Australia and New Zealand, which, very appropriate for this conversation, means I get to kind of oversee, administer, manage, and be the advocate for all things responsible and ethical AI here at Microsoft in Australia and New Zealand.
I love it. That is a very succinct way of putting it down, and I could definitely not have done that, so thank you. But I think to start off the conversation, I think it's a perfect place to bring it up. What is responsible AI? Because it's something I work with every day, and I still, and sometimes I'm like, get asked that question, and I'm like, what is a better way of doing it? I mean, you've done a great job succinctly so far. Hit me with another one, please.
All right, I'll try and keep it up. But it's an awesome question, probably the best place to start, because it is an easy phrase to kind of talk about, but unpicking it and really putting the detail behind what we mean by that is probably the challenge. And we've been through some iterations. I mean, we talk about responsible AI today, and the industry broadly talks about responsible AI, but that was a journey that started with this idea of ethical AI or ethical technology or the ethical application of technology. And it shifted to responsible AI because really we're trying to get through that language is this idea that responsibility is something you take on. So there's a human ownership of that. It's not something we give over to the systems or the computers. We're not expecting them to be responsible. We have to take that responsibility. And ethical, as much as we all kind of get the sense of what ethics means, ethics are very much about our personal point of view, whereas responsibility is something that can be shared. And it's something we can all take on. So that's kind of how we arrived at why responsible AI. But to your question about what is it, it's really not about AI. And it's really about this sort of considered application of how AI is intersected into our world, and the social and human interactions between technology and us is really where responsible AI tries to fit in. So it's kind of about the impact of humans and the consideration of data and AI and models as an amplifier of what is unfortunately the true nature of us as human beings, which is we are biased and unethical in our very core often. So I don't know if that was a good explanation, but it kind of highlights how complex it is.
Yeah, and I think it's so interesting, and I was recently talking about this, how AI essentially has become such an ingrained part of people's lives that we don't even realize we're using it on a every minute basis. Like if you open your phone, you're using about 15 different versions of an AI running at any given stage, right? And that responsible part of it, where at least is kind of bringing back to the front of like, hey, let's just look at what we're doing here for a second, and let's just go back over it for a minute. It does play such a big part. I guess a follow-on question from that, just based on kind of it's everywhere and we should look at it a bit more. What should we be looking out for? I think is there something you're worth sharing?
Yeah, look, no, you're right. It is everywhere, and that's sort of, I won't say that's part of the problem, but the challenge we have is we're trying to almost kind of rein in the beast that is AI, when maybe it's a bit too late because it's already out there and we're using it in so much of our lives. But what we're looking for is, there's a couple of three things. The number one thing is the way in which AI is built is, as you all know, we take data and we use data to feed models that teach it how to behave, react, or learn a particular set of behaviors and traits. And that data is, data that's gathered from the world, and typically there's a lot of bias in that world. It doesn't reflect the true nature of the world. It often reflects a very biased nature. So that's the kind of stuff you're looking for. I mean, when you pick it apart, there's all these things. There's the data that feeds it. There's the model and the choices your model makes and the way it interprets the data. And then one that doesn't really get talked about a lot is how that AI gets implemented in the real world. And we think about usability, the user experience, the inclusive design principles around that. So there's a lot to it. As I said, it's not like you can just say, hey, it's a technology problem, it's a UI problem, it's a business problem. It's sort of everyone's problem.
That's a very interesting way of putting it. Now, as you two mentioned, we are using AI in every day of our life, and every application that we use have some trace of AIs in it. But you mentioned that it's a responsibility of all of us to make sure that we are not biased towards whatever we are building. So if you're building an application, is there any tool available to us to maybe help us to identify if we are biased, if there is any bias in our models, or anything that we can at least help us to identify? And then maybe next step will be for us to make it better.
Yeah, for sure.
Is there any tool that we can help us?
Yeah, and the important thing, I mean, there are a couple of tools that I'm aware of, and there's probably many, many, many out there. It's important to note, like, yes, these tools that we can talk about are great at helping us identify bias, but we can't rely on them. They're not the only thing we should be using to sort of manage that risk that AI has at its core. And there are tools that, obviously I come from Microsoft, so I'm very familiar with the tools that we've put out there. All of which are open source based on Python and other tool sets, are very applicable to a lot of frameworks. But tools like FairLearn or Interpret ML or something called DICE, which is Diverse Counterfactuals, are mechanisms that allow you to look at the way a data set is being interpreted by your model and then look for the sort of the swings, the clustering of data in poor models. So, I mean, a really easy example is, you've got a data set that you're using to determine, loan application propensity approvals, and you're pulling data on previous loan applications, and that data in it is going to have the gender, the postcode, the age of those applicants. And it's very easy for the model to start seeing patterns in those things that determine, well, actually, turns out that white males between the age of 35 and 45 are the best at paying loans. Well, that's not really true. It's only because they're the most likely to have applied for loans in the past that they have the higher propensity. So that's very hard to see for a layperson. Even a data scientist looking at the data is not going to noticeably see that. But a tool like FairLearn or other tools tries to visualize that data mapping, that data disparity. So you kind of get heat maps. If you can imagine a heat map of your data, and you can see, it going off the charts on males on one side and not on females, and it's giving you the tools to see it. And that's often what you're trying to do with bias. Is not, I mean, you can try and remove bias from data, but that also then changes the data, which maybe changes the outcome. But you can visualize and understand that bias, which is really what the tools are helpful for doing.
Exactly. So 100% to you. Your first point is it's responsibility of the human to make sure that to remove the bias. There are tools to help us to identify, but I guess at the end of the day, it goes back to maybe data scientists to identify those gaps and make sure that enough data has been given to the tools, and maybe train it with a broader data set, I would say.
Well, and something to think about is, we talk about the data scientist being the person that needs to kind of identify that and use these tools to showcase it, but they also need to be operating in an environment where the data scientist is able to flag these biases and say to the business, hey, I know you've got this outcome you want to drive, but you need to understand the data we're using is going to create a bad outcome in the market. And that becomes a whole conversation around culture in organizations to adopt AI.
I think there are a lot of factors that comes into picture when we are talking about biases. So, I mean, the example that you mentioned, the loan application, who are applying. So we have to go by statistic, and scientists and some data scientists needs to check the history of I don't know, a few years back and see how many people have different country. And I guess there are a lot of factors, and how we maybe capture those factors within our data modeling or maybe tagging. It's very important. It will impact the outcome, I would say.
Absolutely, yeah.
Sorry,
I
Akansha, you
think
were
it's
saying
super
something.
interesting how recently someone was asking the question of like, oh, low code AI, it's just getting rid of the data scientist, like it's going to replace. And I'm like, this is exactly the proponent
Yeah.
for kind of that argument, right? That was essentially what I was talking about. It's like, yep, okay, great, we've automated one part of the problem. The rest of it still needs those humans involved. Because I mean, these mentioned this, like ML models are essentially just mimicking what they've seen in the past. Like they're not making any groundbreaking, interesting decisions or anything really at the end of the day. They're just, hey, this happened, maybe it'll happen again. Like as at the end of the day, it's such an interesting piece
propensity.
of puzzle.
Yeah, I mean, you're measuring a percentage of propensity in a tool. But, what I think is something that often gets missed is that, people either have this opinion that AI is just capable of so much. I think we kind of all know that AI is capable of amazing things in a very narrow scope. And part of the conversation, that culture piece I mentioned earlier, is actually helping people understand that AI isn't necessarily all powerful or all evil or necessarily bad. AI is sort of fairly ambivalent. It's not bad or good. It's often the humans or the human application or the human consideration of how that AI gets used that is probably where we need to be looking at ourselves perhaps a bit more.
For sure. And I think when you were talking about that lone example, you start thinking about the kind of the big examples you hear in the industry, right? Whenever anyone talks about like, oh, AI is terrible, it's always like the same kind of examples of was it one of the big tech companies that had the programming in place for intake of resumes, and it was just filtering out all the women because only men ever succeeded in that role. Or there's all the other big ones where especially, and you start thinking about it, like the government has a lot of our data, which I am a big proponent for. I'm like, yep, I'll pay my taxes, take my money. It's great. I can have better roads on the side of the road. But at the other end of it, how they use it is so much more important at the same time, because the implications of that data can be so much far-fetched. Is there things you want to share about possibly in terms of just around how and if responsible AI is being taken into place at governments and stuff, given the context of, and I know it's not necessarily an Australian problem, but there's definitely been kind of, I think it was a New Zealand border control where they weren't able to flag certain backgrounds of people when they were coming through passport control because they just hadn't put that cultural backset into the data set in the back. Or police in America kind of using facial recognition, which was automatically identifying people with darker skin colors as possibly leading to a slightly more dangerous outlook. And it's terrifying when you hear those kind of things. But is there things in place? Are they beginning to take that into consideration?
Yeah, I mean, I get all those points you bring up. I mean, I hear them and you kind of go, but really, is that an actual thing that happened? But the truth is, it's both our naivety in terms of how we apply AI and us looking in a mirror, and the reality of the data that represents our history is incredibly unpleasant when you look at the details of it. We are biased, we are, racist. There are all the things that humans have been over this time. But, to your point around governments, though, and I should have said earlier, not to go on about what I do, but the other role I do have as well outside of my Microsoft job is I sit on the New South Wales Government AI Review Committee. So there's 10 of us and sit on that committee. We have done for a short while now. And that was really established because under Minister Dominello's tutelage, he wanted to push AI into government services because there's no question AI is a super powerful, positive tool in creating these amazing, inclusive and valued outcomes for us as citizens, creating better ways for us to engage in government, smarter government systems that talk to us when we need them to and engage with us in the right time and place. But he knew that he needed to build something that had some degree of governance. And this is the important part around AI is we're never going to get it right. Data is always going to be somewhat of a challenge. Models are about learning and interpretation. And the AI lives on. By definition, it learns. So the New South Wales government built a great mechanism. It's called the New South Wales AI Assurance Framework, which is a tool that at least enforces every government agency to follow a set of questions and guidance and thought processes before they embark on AI. And that to me is a mark of real maturity, because it's not saying, it's not trying to build a checklist, because you can't. It's not about saying yes or no. It's about saying we need to talk about fairness, inclusion, security, privacy, reliability, all those things that are important. And there's never going to be a yes/no answer, but there's always a discussion, and that's what I think is so relative there. If you look to the Europe, I mean, the European government or the European Parliament is starting to build AI regulation for Europe, and they're thinking differently about it, and they're trying to categorize AI in its risk categories: low risk, medium risk, high risk. So there's lots of good things going on. There's always more to be done, and this will never be a problem that we just tick box and say it's solved. But for me, the most important thing and a mark of maturity is, I keep saying culture, and I'll come back to that point of a culture where people are talking about the risks. The Jurassic Park example of just because you can do something, should you do something, still rings true, even 30 years later, that it's really the question we should always be asking ourselves.
I think it's really, really true. And I think the culture part is just, so many people interpret that sometimes, or just kind of underestimate the importance of it. And even just that diversity part of the teams and stuff, to be able to identify some of these things, just be like, hey, I don't necessarily see anyone like me in this data set. Maybe that's a problem as we go and solve this question. And to that, I know some of the stories and points we've talked about so far. These are very well-known ones that where AI has gone wrong. And I know we keep repeating the same ones, but I think it stands to the thing of every time I hear even the same ones, it just reminds me of it. Yes, I know that those are problems. Yes, they're sitting at the back of my head, but I think it's a really interesting piece of, if I'm constantly thinking about them when I'm building models, wait, did I check for that specific problem? Did I check if my model's racist? Yes, I know I should look out for it, but also if I'm reminded of the times it's gone terribly wrong, I'm going to think about it a bit more. But yeah, I think it's really important to keep talking about them, I think, just as much as raising it.
For sure.
I think it's really good to hear that the government is taking it as taking advice from the expert to make sure that they're doing it right. And I was super happy to hear that they're actually doing that. To make sure that at least they are following some of the principles and making sure that the AI usage is to somewhat responsible. And it's really interesting to see that. Do you think that, in your opinion, do you think the industry is doing a good job to make sure that the AI solution that they do create are responsible, or do you think that we're still way behind that ideal picture?
It's a loaded question in some ways. I mean, obviously.
Based on your experience, what you've seen into the market, or the clients that you have advised so far, or they seek out for your help or your input, is there a lot of gaps that you see, or do you think it's in the right?
I think it's moving in the right direction. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, but it's what I'm seeing is, so I've had this responsible AI lead role now at Microsoft for probably now 2.5 years or so, and a clear marker for me is when I first started in the role, I might see one request for a responsible AI review every couple of months. And I know we're doing a lot more AI work than that. So, clearly that's we're not doing enough. But then now I'm seeing 2 or 3 a week coming through my inbox. And that's just my world in Microsoft and what I'm seeing. And so for me, there's a marker there that the word is getting out and people are considering the thought process of, hey, should we do this? Is this considered a risk? What are the things we should be doing? And outside of Microsoft's world, which is obviously skews my view somewhat, I see this across our competitors. I see it across the big banks and the customers and the big players in the market. I see it in small startups. I think it's growing. It's getting there. It's one of these things that isn't going to be, a job done. We're not going to create a tick box process and say, yeah, right now we're all approved for responsible AI. There's a trust mark that we need, that we're going to have. But I think there's definitely, if you will, sort of a hockey stick movement, and we're moving towards this idea that more and more people are talking about it now. Whether they're implementing it fully, whether they're doing it to the best that they possibly could, whether we're doing every single step along the way, I doubt that. There's always going to be room for improvement. But I think it's getting better, no doubt about it.
Do you think they have enough information to make that call or seek out for help? I mean, not everybody might know about responsible AI. They just know that the tools is out there. They go and use it, whatever they want it. Do you think there's enough information out there for people or companies to make sure that there are principles that they have to follow, reuse?
I think you've hit
the nail on. How we can get that word out. Yeah.
That to me is the crux of the problem, is that, I see this issue all the time. And I'll put a context on it. Part of my job is to encourage our Microsoft people, sellers, to have these conversations with customers. But if they don't feel like they have enough knowledge in their head to have that conversation fully, they won't have it, because there's, human nature is, I'm not going to start a conversation I can't fully act upon. And I think that's generally the case. If you look out in the community, people have kind of started to get this idea that there's considerations to be made. We should be not biased. We should think about privacy. We should think about inclusion. But they don't have the mechanisms to have a deeper conversation. And that is, I think, slowing down that adoption. So that, we need to share more knowledge, experience, information. We just need to be communicating more. So something we did recently at Microsoft is we published our responsible AI assessment process and our standard, which is how we do it internally. It's sort of the internal processes in an attempt to get more people to know how we do it. It doesn't mean it's the best way, but it's the way that we're using, and we want to share that as much as we can.
This way you're bringing awareness, which is good.
Yeah,
because that will help other people to look different aspects of it.
Absolutely.
Which will be beneficial. That's awesome.
Cool.
I think leading from that, yes, there might be like this whole point of, if you don't understand it, where do we go with it? Is there any way, or do you see this being an issue of implementing it completely incorrectly, or even halfway and you're like, oh, that's actually worse than doing it full way? Or is there things that people should look out for as they kind of dive into this world?
Yeah, look, I don't know if it's not so much about doing it partially incorrectly, but one of the things that has become really apparent in the AI world is it's not about the AI tool itself. It's about the way in which it gets deployed. And that's a really complex set of things around, the physical environment, the data in which it's fed on, the manner in which it presents itself to end users, the way in which it behaves when it goes wrong. And, I think we talked earlier about this idea of sort of maturity in this, and, maturity in those processes is having a mechanism that catches the issues with AI. What happens when somebody uses an AI system, they're in a chatbot service, or they're communicating with an important health agency or a finance agency, and suddenly the chatbot either gives them wrong information or presents them with a dead end. And that person's presumably in a fairly traumatic situation. If it's health or finance related, they want information. How does the AI handle that? What happens to that person, that human that has now been, brought up into that AI service? Those are the kinds of things I find often get missed. We see a really heavy focus on, get the right data, curate the data, label it, classify it, get the data really clean, build a really good model that's got a high propensity for non-false positives or false negatives or whatever we're trying to get out of it. And then we implement it and we completely forget about what might happen as it's being used. And then do you have the process to sort of catch that, fix it, and repair it, and get that, kind of error, that issue that's been exposed fixed in the system? And it all sort of then comes back to, how agile are you as an organization? So I always, when I talk to people who are thinking about taking AI into their business, the conversation I really want to have is, how do you handle things that go wrong in your business? What do you do today when something happens with your systems and your customers are impacted? What's your process for remediation? Because if they can't do it today with non-AI systems, what would be the catastrophic impact of it if you had an AI system that suddenly gets out of hand and is doing things really bad?
I mean, I can think of all the movies.
That's really
difficult. Right?
Unfortunately, movies have been, and I grew up in that period, so I've watched all those movies, and that's what we think, is. Actually, it's funny you mentioned movies, because there's a fatalistic perspective to it. We see these movies, we see, Skynet, or pick your movie choice, and we kind of get caught up in this idea that, well, that's what's going to happen because that's what's going to happen. And so I don't know if you've ever seen the movie. It's a Disney movie, but don't hold that against me. The movie called Tomorrowland, which is this construct around this idea that the future is going to be what we already decided to be, because we've already decided we can't solve the world's problems, climate change and all these things. And it kind of paints this picture that if we lose faith in the optimism of what is possible with AI, if we just build this narrative that says AI is destructive, evil, and never going to work for us, then we will actually miss out on so much potential for what AI could do. So it's really important for us as a community of practitioners, advocates, and people who talk about AI to not lose sight of the fact that it's actually the most positive potentially impactful tool set that we've created as human beings to create inclusive, wonderful experiences for lots of people. And it's not really all bad. It's actually quite good.
That is that my favorite takeaway from this, possibly, even before it's finished? I think it
hope
might
so.
be. I love that. And it really helps, because it's like the whole Disney part, right? Where I'm like, it makes it accessible to try and explain it to others. But what I was going to touch on at what you mentioned, and that was another big thing for me, I think, at least, especially because every time I'm talking to clients and people coming in with AI problems, they're usually coming in asking for help from consulting point of view, is where, hey, we want to build. We just want to build, and we want to get to a stage where we have something. So we never get to really discuss that kind of like, okay, well, what's going to happen once you build it? Where is it going to go? And it's so important that you mentioned it, because I'm a big fan of design-led, like human-led kind of development in general. I think it makes a whole different mindset going into developing anything. And kind of looking at it that from a perspective of like, wait, how is this actually being used by the person at the other end? I think I see it all the time in like development, where you're building apps. Great. Okay. How are you going to use it? It's such a big part of it. And it's shocking to me when we talk about it now that it isn't just kind of an accepted part of building a model.
Yeah, it is, and you sort of you're obviously a practitioner of this, and so you live a little bit in that world. But if you get outside of the bubble that we all live in, and then kind of look at externally how people think about this, I mean, one of the great things that we often, particularly in the government example, actually we talked about earlier, is we have this idea about social license to operate. So, what is society going to allow you to do with their data and with the services you provide, and what is that exchange of trust that you have with them? And in government, that's really important. As citizens, we expect certain things from government, and in return, they expect certain things of us in terms of the information we provide. But you can translate that into any commercial implementation of AI, and that conversation with any commercial entity, you want to go and build AI, you want to get involved in this opportunity for competitive advantage, or build a new market, or kind of just explore what information you can about to create better customer experiences. But you really have to kind of make sure that you connect the dots on, but what do your customers expect of your brand, expect of your service, expect of your business? Because you can't break that. The old adage that trust is easily made and very hard to repair once you've broken it. It's so important in AI, and it's often forgotten because people think of it as another tech project where you just build a technology, deploy it, and then customers use it. But AI is not like that. It's going to learn, it's going to adapt, it's going to change, and it's going to do things that you didn't expect it to do. And you've got to take that into consideration.
I guess hence why we need to be more cautious around the usage of AI and how we build solutions around AI. And we have to think of a long-term impact that it's going to have to people or end user or whoever is going to use it. On that note, I'm cautious about the time, so I'm going to ask one last question. You briefly mentioned throughout our conversation, but what is your top advice for the organization who are building AI solution nowadays? Or your recommendation?
Yeah, I mean, and we've covered a lot of the things, I guess.
Yes.
I'll give you a couple of them, but I want to sort of preface it by I'm an eternal optimist, and I believe, as I've said, that AI has such great potential. And I think that it really worries me that as a society and as a culture and organizations that we're going to miss that opportunity by focusing on what it does badly as opposed to what it could do. But that aside, I would say three things that need to happen. And I've mentioned culture a lot, but really build a governance and a culture first that's capable of adapting, taking experimentation, learning from failures, and recovering from failures before you do anything with AI, because that's going to be your safety harness that means you can do it right and you can capture those issues. Data is the engine of AI, and there's lots of work going on to change that approach and think about AI with sparse data models and think differently about it. But ultimately, you need good data. So think about data management as an organization. Think about how you're going to curate, own, and be the custodian of data. And then the last one for me is a bit on what I just said earlier, but don't lose sight of what your business is and what it delivers, and that trust that customers have in you to do that. And think about using AI to amplify that engagement, that exchange you have with your customers. Think about the outcome to your customers or to your citizens or to your end users. When you're building AI, don't just build it for the sake of innovation. That will ultimately not be a road of a good outcome.
and it won't last long.
No, well, it might last long until you end up on the front page of the
usage.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, that is true. That is true. Oh, thanks for sharing. It was really good. At least, I guess, as I said, I guess we all have to be cautious and careful. It's not just one person. It's every responsibility of every individual to make sure that it is put in a good use, I guess.
And Somi, last point, because you said this earlier yourself, humans stay in the process. I'm a big advocate for the fact that AI is a powerful decision assistance tool. It's not a decision-making tool. Humans make decisions. AI helps them make decisions better, faster, smarter, with more data. But ultimately, it should be a human decision.
100%.
I think
agree
that
with you.
is the absolute perfect note to end this on, to be honest, because I have got a lot of spiraling to do after this conversation, which tends to be the way I end most of these global AI podcasts, to be honest. It's usually like, oh my God, there's just so many thoughts in my brain and I'm going to go spiral in all of them. But I think it was a really, really good chat. And I'm hoping like anyone who listens to us, at least, I mean, I've done this for the last like whatever many years, and I'm like, things to reconsider and blind spots to think about again. Which is the whole point of the podcast, is just to bring up different points and different viewpoints that we can kind of help shed a little bit more, I guess, into the front light of it all and highlight those blind spots, which for me, I think is definitely just the fact that we actually need to look at the person using the AI model a little bit more than I probably am at the moment. But Lee, thank you so much for your time. It is very, very appreciated from us, and I'm sure from the people who've been listening to the episode today. So thank you so much.
It's a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Thanks for your time, Lee. It was awesome.
Thank you. Awesome.
Perfect. Well, folks, we will see you all again for the next episode, which will be out next month. But until then, I hope you all stay safe and use AI responsibly.
Have a good one.